I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, the plan, joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back on the program this week, Liz. We have a lot to get to. There has been a mistrial in a case that we discussed last week. Tell me about it.
Yes, Chance. And by the way, it's great to be back to talk with you. Yes, the case we talked about last week, the murder trial of David James Gomez. As you'll recall, he was being tried on a murder charge in the 2015 shooting death of Isaac Flores, his business associate, in a hauling operation. Well, we heard testimony for a week in that the defense claimed that Gomez shot Flores in self-defense during a struggle, but prosecutors said the facts didn't match with Gomez's accounting of what happened during this confrontation. So jurors started deliberating the case on a Monday afternoon in felony impact court, which had been presided over by visiting Judge Dick Alcala. But by Wednesday morning, jurors told another visiting judge, Mark Luchin, that they were hopelessly deadlocked and could not reach a unanimous decision. Now, you'll recall Gomez faced life in prison if he had been convicted of killing Flores, and he died after the confrontation between the two men at Gomez's office in April of 2015. So this case is going to go back on the docket, and it's going to be reset for a later date.
And that was just, they couldn't reach a verdict. I mean, they didn't get the evidence that they thought that they needed to either acquit or to convict. Right.
It seems that whenever this happens, I've covered a couple of mistrials lately, and basically defense attorneys, in this case, George Schaefer, he maintained that, Isaac Flores, who was David Gomez's business partner, had, violent tendencies. He had a really bad temper, and he was known to punch people. And he told the jury in his opening statements and maintained this string through the trial that Gomez feared for his life. And when he was backed up against his desk or up against, the wall, and when Flores attempted to crawl over the desk to confront him in some way, he fired his gun. So apparently, the jury felt like they couldn't really reach a decision. I think a particular case I covered recently, also a murder trial, the situation there, this I believe was the Arroyo case that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, where it was split 6-6. And, it becomes very painful for the jurors. I remember in that case that there were many that ended up crying and when they left the courtroom. So, they take their job very seriously. And in this case, it's going to have to come back, and we'll have trial another day. So stay tuned on that case.
Now, Elizabeth, you mentioned so far in our conversation early on in today's episode already the names of two different judges. Is that abnormal? I mean, usually it's the same judge for the case, correct?
Yes, normally it is. Now, what we have here in felony impact court in Bexar County, it's basically an extra court, because one of the things that happened this year, actually this happened last year, was that the Bexar County Jail was almost to capacity. I think they can have probably about close to 4,000 people, and they were actually almost maxed out. So when that happens, the county gets, together along with the sheriff, and they begin discussing what they're going to do as far as how they're going to keep, the jail not so crowded. So when that happened, Bexar County decided to open felony impact court. And that currently is being presided by the regular judge, Laura Parker. But, it's like everything else. This is summertime. Sometimes judges will go on vacation. Other times they may have conferences to go to, or, they could be sick or some other thing. But in this case, Judge Dick Alcala, presided over the entire trial. And there was some reason that he was not able to be there. So when the jury, came back and said that they basically were hung and they couldn't make a unanimous decision, Mark Luchin, visiting Judge Mark Luchin, was able to take that. And it works out basically because by the time the jury gets the case, they've already heard all of the evidence. They've seen everything. The proceedings have stopped. So basically all he was going to have to do was to just read the verdict to the court and take it from the jurors. So, again, we'll be seeing this case, somewhere down the road.
And of course, as we've mentioned, this was a mistrial. So this is yet another case that might make multiple appearances here on the Docket podcast. We're going to move forward to another case that is also about murder. And, obviously any murder case is unfortunate. This one specifically. So the death of a cop. And this is an older case that has a newer update. Tell me about that, Liz.
Yes, I had a chance to go to federal court last week to cover the closing of a really wild tale that happened in San Antonio, or near San Antonio area case in 2014 that my colleague Guillermo Contreras and former colleague Jason Book have covered through the years. This is the case against Jesse Santibanez and Alfredo Cardona. These were the last people that were sentenced in the killing of Balcones Heights police officer Julian Pacina. Now, this was a really wild case, Chance. Pacina had one foot in law enforcement and the other in gangs. He pretended to be a member of the Texas Mexican Mafia. And at the time of his death, he was under federal investigation. Federal and state authorities were closing in. He was dealing drugs. The police officer, he was trying to get in good with the Texas Mexican Mafia. But as authorities were closing in, members of the Texas Mexican Mafia apparently got there first, and he was killed in May of 2014 outside Notorious Inc. And this is a tattoo and piercing parlor he co-owned on Hillcrest in Balcones Heights, which is basically a small city in the middle of San Antonio. So last week, U.S. District Judge Xavier Rodriguez closed this final chapter in this wild tale with the sentencing of the last two people that have been charged in his murder. Santibanez, who was known as Jay, and Cardona, who they called Freddie Lowe, each were sentenced to 2 life terms. One for the charge of murder in aid of racketeering, and one for discharging a firearm during a murder in aid of racketeering. And this was basically the last part of their case, because each of the men were found guilty last November. And they were actually convicted in part on testimony from another gang member named Jerry Idrogo, who people called Spooks, who had already pleaded guilty in Pacina's murder. So the interesting thing about this, there's a lot of interesting things about this case, but it's just a whole different thing, basically, from what I'm used to in covering just state, district court. I do cover a lot of murders, but this is an interesting case because of how everything went down. There were other people who were in the gang. There was a sergeant in the gang. They kind of have these titles, and then these two particular men were more of kind of like a lower level gang members. This is all from testimony that happened, that established these links during the trials that occurred last year. So, testimony at the trial of Santibáñez and Cardona established that Officer Pesina, who was 29 years old when he died and had been a Balcones Heights police officer since 2009, had passed himself off as a, quote, made member of the Mexican mafia. He was selling drugs, and he was doing what they call paying the dime, which is like a 10% street tax that goes to the gang. And he also kept his career as a law enforcement officer secret. So once gang members found out that Pesina was a cop, one of the higher ups, in this case, a man by the name of Jerry Spooks Idrogo, basically ordered the hit on Officer Pesina.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney.
So they arranged for a pickup of the dime outside his tattoo parlor, and the two men were dropped off by Idrogo on May 4th, 2014. So when Pesina approached the car and paid Idrogo this 10%, street tax, if you will, the men shot and killed Pesina. And, again, it was done on an order by Idrogo that basically came from another man above him. And he was shot with a shotgun first, and then again with a 9mm. So what was interesting was before Santibáñez was sentenced last week, and both men had pleaded not guilty to the charges. But Santibáñez did something interesting. He apologized to the judge and to the court and his family for putting them through the ordeal. He did say that he was innocent of all charges. He cried as he was saying these statements in court. And he said that he feels like the government has punished him for exercising his right to a fair trial, and that he's being punished for this and for other murders. And he did ask the judge to show mercy on his behalf because he felt like there was no physical evidence, no DNA, just government witnesses. And Cardona also maintained his innocence, but he did not speak to the court. So attorneys who represented the men, there were two of them, Tom McHugh and John Convery, they basically called the lengthy prison terms that these both men got. And they got 2 life sentences. They're going to be served at the same time. But basically that, that doesn't mean much because they're not going to probably will never get out. So they believe that this is a raw deal because the federal statute requires a life sentence in these types of offenses. And, with federal, you see these types of sentences. They're a lot, they seem a lot heftier because you really don't have, from, in my limited experience in federal, but being at the state district court level, you really don't seem to have the opportunity for agreements in federal cases. But what's interesting, McHugh told the court before sentencing that he said something pretty interesting. He told the judge, "You and I are dinosaurs. We're obsolete. Nothing we can say or do will make a difference." And he felt like the government was determining the defendant's sentence. And Convery, the attorney for Cardona, agreed. And he said that, there's no doubt there was a killing and they're not being insensitive, but he felt like what he said, quote, "The real baddest of the bad guys got a deal, and the judge's hands are tied because of the statutory sentencing requirement."
And so you've been, kind of telling this story of how, because of the federal mandates, and it's different than the state court that you usually cover, these 2 life sentences might mean, in fact, life, even though they're going to be served at the same time. Let's talk about that a little bit now. You've already mentioned how someone got a deal in this case, but despite that being the fact, the judge's hands were tied, and these were the sentences that were given. What's the reality here when you get 2 life sentences in federal court? What does that mean usually?
Well, basically, like in the courtrooms where I cover cases at the Cadena Reeves Justice Center, I'll talk to attorneys and I'll ask them, so is there any chance for parole? Or they have different guidelines for different things. So in some cases, when someone is sentenced to life in prison, and, you can be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That happens in capital murder cases when they're not seeking death. But in the federal world, a life sentence is a life sentence. There's no parole at the federal level. And, because my understanding is that a life sentence, 60 years can be considered life. So in many times when a person has been sentenced to life in state district court, I will ask attorneys, so is there any possibility of parole? And usually they will say to me, well, many times life is considered, like 60 years. And a person would have to serve at least half of that time. So usually, you can see, someone serving 30 years, and if you're an older person, I will bring up, a case that we talked about earlier, Mark Benavides. He wasn't sentenced to life, but he got 80 years. And he's going to have to serve at least 30, in which he would be he would be in his 70s by the time he was released. But that doesn't happen in federal. I was told that there is no parole at the federal level, and life means life. So they did get 2 life sentences, 2 terms, but which will be served at the same time, but they likely will never see the light of day again, really.
And then finally, Liz, to wrap things up before we say goodbye, obviously this happened several years ago. Just now, getting these 2 life sentences for these 2 men who have been convicted in connection with the murder of this police officer who was involved with this gang. Is this the end of this story? Is there anything else that's still pending, or is this basically it for this crime?
This is basically it. This closes the chapter. With the 2 men being convicted and sentenced. These are the 2 men that basically were said to have been the triggermen in the slaying of Julian Piscina. So this does close the book.
And that's also going to close today's episode of The Docket. As always, I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, joining me by phone today. Great to speak with you, Liz. Have a great week, and we'll talk about 7 days from now.
Thanks a lot, Chance. Take care.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, taking time out of her week to join me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio and Bexar County, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.